You carry a weight that most people don't even recognize in you. A quiet, insistent hum of unworthiness that has been the soundtrack to your life for as long as you can remember. And it's especially loud around moments of celebration. The truth is, when your foundation was built on the shifting sand of a narcissistic parent's emotional needs, your sense of self was never truly about you. It was about your performance, your utility, and your ability to keep the peace, which leaves a permanent, aching void where genuine self-worth should reside. It's the reason why compliments feel like scrutiny, why birthdays feel like a performance you haven't adequately rehearsed, and why the simple act of acknowledging your own success feels like a violation of an unspoken rule from a past you thought you'd left behind, but whose ghost still dictates the limits of your joy. We're going to step into that silence today, to trace the exact lineage of this feeling, and finally give language to the deep-seated pain of the adult child who feels undeserving of their own celebration, offering not just understanding, but a tangible path back to the self you were never truly allowed to be. The very first seeds of this feeling were sown in a childhood where emotional stability was conditional, a variable that shifted based on the mood and needs of the narcissistic parent, leaving you constantly bracing for the next emotional earthquake. You learned quickly that the most stable you could make your world was by making yourself small, by focusing entirely on the erratic emotional temperature of the room, sacrificing your own burgeoning self to anticipate and mitigate your parents' reactions. There was no space for the full, messy expression of childhood joy or need, because that space was perpetually occupied by the parent's own overwhelming emotional landscape, forcing you into a premature adulthood where your primary function was to regulate the feelings of the one who was supposed to be regulating yours. The child internalizes this dynamic, absorbing the silent message that their own authentic feelings and needs are a disruption, a burden, or even a threat to the parent's fragile equilibrium, leading to the profound and early conviction that the world is safer when you are less. This is the moment where the child steps up to become the emotional caretaker, the little mediator who understands implicitly that the parent's happiness, which they mistake for the family's safety, rests entirely on their tiny shoulders. You become an exquisite student of the parent's moods, a tiny oracle predicting the storms and sunny days, always on duty, always vigilant, always seeking to prevent the inevitable collapse by making yourself the perfect, non-demanding child. The narcissistic parent, lacking true empathy and emotional reciprocity, readily accepts this dynamic, effectively turning the child into a mirror, a source of constant validation that never reflects back a genuine, safe love, but rather a shallow, transactional approval tied to achievement and quiet compliance. This early, devastating role reversal lays the groundwork for a lifetime of seeking validation outside the self, because the only worth you ever knew was the one you earned through exhausting emotional labor for someone else. The child learns a devastating calculus. My worth is equal to the absence of trouble I cause, and the emotional support I provide to the adult. Your entire existence becomes a subtle act of self-effacement, a continuous editing of your own reality to fit the narrative of your parents' needs, which means that any success or joy you experience for yourself is subconsciously perceived as a moment of danger, a break in character that might draw negative attention, or, worse, make you less available for the parent's emotional demands. This internalization of responsibility is not a conscious choice, but a desperate survival strategy. A deep-seated belief that if you could only be perfect, if you could only be quiet enough, successful enough, or emotionally attuned enough, then finally, everything would be stable and you would be safe. It's a foundational experience of being seen only as a function, never as a separate, beloved being, which cripples the ability to later accept unconditional love or to simply be without a discernible purpose. You never learned what it feels like to have your inherent value celebrated, only the value of what you could do for them. The pain is a silent one, the perpetual echo of an emotionally empty room, forcing you to seek that missing validation in every future relationship and achievement. This early childhood dynamic solidifies into a full-blown parentification, a profound inversion where the child is effectively acting as the emotional spouse or parent to the adult whose maturity failed them, making the child the stabilizer in a system that should have been providing stability to the child. The child's brain, in its brilliant effort to survive an unsafe environment, becomes hyper-attuned to the minutiae of the parent's nonverbal cues, developing an uncanny ability to read the environment, not for pleasure or connection, but for threat assessment. They become masterful at sensing the parent's brewing dissatisfaction, the subtle shifts in tone, the fractional narrowing of the eyes that signals an impending emotional storm, and they adjust their behavior instantly, becoming a small, self-regulating machine whose sole purpose is to keep the big, powerful adult from collapsing or lashing out. This role inversion teaches a dangerous lesson about self-sacrifice, that the only way to earn belonging and temporary peace is to obliterate your own needs, to perform the role of the mature, responsible one who never needs nurturing. You become the container for the parent's overflow, the emotional dumping ground for their anxieties and inadequacies, while your own well of needs remains completely dry, and you grow up believing that your deepest needs are not only irrelevant, but actively detrimental to the people you love. The child's authentic self is swiftly moved off stage, replaced by a meticulously crafted persona designed to meet the parent's expectations, a quiet, agreeable self that poses no challenge and requires no significant emotional energy from the fragile adult. The child is forced to become the adult in the room, constantly anticipating and mediating the emotional turbulence of the narcissistic parent. This premature maturity is not strength, but a psychological burden, a performance of competency that masks a deep, unmet yearning for safe, authentic childhood dependence. You learn that to be needy is to be rejected, so you silence the inner child's cries and prioritize the adult's comfort and emotional regulation above all else, simply to survive. The child develops an almost psychic ability to sense shifts in the atmosphere, becoming the family's barometer for emotional danger, a stabilizer who must always be perfectly calibrated. This mechanism ensures the parent's emotional stability, which the child equates with their own physical and psychological safety, cementing the belief that their role is to perform emotional labor. The inner life of the child is put on permanent hold, their genuine self disappearing behind the mask of the dutiful, small adult whose only purpose is to maintain the parent's fragile ego and the illusion of family stability. The adult world then inherits a person who believes, at their core, that their role is to stabilize others, making intimacy feel like a heavy responsibility rather than a mutual exchange of authentic self. This inversion leaves a legacy of chronic exhaustion and a deep, self-canceling instinct, the need to read the room and adjust the self before anyone else has to ask. What we are describing is a psychological mechanism of hypervigilance and parentification, not in clinical terms, but in the raw, lived experience of having your nervous system perpetually on high alert, a survival response that never fully turns off. Hypervigilance is the state of always scanning the horizon for a threat, even when you're ostensibly safe, because your nervous system was wired in a childhood environment that was fundamentally unpredictable and emotionally unsafe, training your body to be a human lie detector and an emotional seismograph. It means that even now, in a peaceful moment, your stomach might clench, your breath might catch, and you might instantly start running through worst-case scenarios, because that is the only way your body knows how to approach a moment of ease, as a precursor to the next inevitable letdown or emotional demand. Parentification, in this context, is the emotional wound of having your childhood stolen and replaced with the crushing responsibility of adult emotional work, forcing you to suppress your own authentic developmental needs in favor of managing the parent's instability, leading to a deep, underlying conviction that you are fundamentally responsible for everyone else's feelings. This is not just a memory, but a deeply embedded behavioral pattern, a subconscious protocol that kicks in whenever you encounter any relational stress, compelling you to immediately default to fixing, soothing, or disappearing, rather than expressing your own feelings or setting a necessary boundary. The trauma response of becoming the helper or the fixer is a continuation of that child's desperate need to control the environment to feel safe, resulting in an adult who struggles to relax, to receive care, and to simply exist without a task or a perceived duty to perform. Your body is still operating on a nervous system protocol that says, danger is coming, be prepared, do not be the problem. This emotional hypervigilance means you are constantly looking for the hidden agenda, the subtle shift that indicates the other person is about to become demanding or emotionally unavailable, making genuine trust almost impossible. The parentified adult often feels an existential dread when they are not being useful, because their worth was inextricably linked to their function in the family system, leading to a profound internal conflict with the idea of rest or self-care. It's the silent hum of anxiety that tells you that you are about to be exposed, that the fragile piece you have created is about to shatter, and you will be blamed for the debris. This psychological response is not a character flaw, but a brilliant, though now maladaptive, strategy that saved you in a moment when you had no other resources to protect yourself from emotional neglect. Understanding this mechanism helps to depersonalize the anxiety, recognizing it as a learned response rather than a fundamental truth about who you are or the imminent danger of your current environment. The adult must learn to gently persuade the nervous system that the threat is no longer present. A slow, patient process of dismantling the hypervigilant sentry post established in childhood. The healing begins with naming this survival mechanism, acknowledging its purpose in the past, and giving yourself permission to slowly, tentatively, begin to put down the crushing weight of chronic responsibility. The necessity of managing the parent's instability led to a process of masking, a kind of self-disappearance where the real self was put into deep storage, replaced by a performer identity carefully calibrated to appease the emotional needs of the parent, ensuring the highest rate of survival and approval. This performer is meticulously crafted, agreeable, high-achieving, non-demanding, and always emotionally available for others, effectively creating a public self that is a masterpiece of adaptation, but is profoundly disconnected from the authentic, vulnerable core that was never safely witnessed. The performer identity is a hollow success, winning external validation but leaving the adult feeling like an imposter, constantly terrified that the mask will slip and the inadequate, needy inner child will be exposed to the world, confirming their deepest fear of unworthiness. This leads to a pervasive sense of inauthenticity, a feeling of constantly being on even in private moments, because the line between the performing self and the true self has become blurred to the point of near invisibility, making the idea of celebrating yourself a terrifying prospect, because which self is actually being celebrated? The performer is the one who achieves who succeeds, who earns the praise. But the deepest self knows that the praise is conditional, tied to a role, and therefore feels empty and undeserved, which is why compliments often feel like an acute anxiety rather than a genuine lift. The act of celebrating their own existence, their own quiet joy, their own inherent value outside of performance, is fundamentally alien to the adult child, because that act was never modeled or encouraged. Only the celebration of the parent's reflection in the child was permissible. The real self went into hiding very early, deemed too messy, too needy, or too much of a threat to the parent's fragile ego and emotional landscape. This masking creates an emotional double life, where the successful, outwardly composed adult is silently carrying the weight of an inner child who feels abandoned and uncelebrated. The adult becomes a human chameleon, unconsciously shifting their entire demeanor and opinions to match the expectations of their immediate environment, making it almost impossible to know what they truly feel or believe. The performer identity is a survival suit that, over time, feels like a prison, creating a painful, constant internal tension between who they are expected to be and the whisper of who they might actually be. Any moment of true, uninhibited self-expression feels like a profound risk, a vulnerability that could expose the fundamental flaw they have spent a lifetime concealing, their own fundamental neediness and inadequacy. The self that feels unworthy of celebration is the real, unmasked self, which has been taught that its very existence is an inconvenience and that its value must always be earned through relentless performance. The adult child often struggles with basic identity questions because their sense of self was always derived from an external source, leaving a deep, ontological void when the external mirror is removed. Healing means slowly, gently, and with radical kindness, bringing the authentic self out of deep storage, giving it permission to exist without the pressure of performance or the fear of inevitable punishment. Beneath the veneer of the high-functioning, agreeable adult lies the silent wound of the inner child, a profound, unexpressed sorrow carried from the moments of unmet needs that defined your earliest years, and whose cries for connection and safety were constantly silenced by the demands of the narcissistic parent. This inner child is not a metaphorical concept, but a living, breathing emotional memory, a part of your consciousness that is still operating under the assumption that the parent is unavailable and that your needs must therefore remain unarticulated and unmet, leading to a deep, underlying loneliness that no adult achievement can truly fill. The inner child holds all the raw emotion, the fear, the anger, and the grief that the adult has spent a lifetime suppressing, and it is the persistence of their unacknowledged pain that manifests as the adult's sense of unworthiness, especially around moments that naturally call for self-focus and celebration. The adult might intellectually understand that they are successful and deserving of happiness, but the inner child's deeply ingrained conviction, forged in the fires of emotional neglect, is that they are fundamentally bad, a burden, or simply not worth the effort. And this emotional core belief constantly sabotages the adult's attempts at self-validation. The wound is silent because the child was taught that silence was safety. Expressing needs was dangerous, so the suffering was internalized, becoming a quiet, corrosive shame that permeates every success, making the adult feel that they are always taking up too much space. The moments when you feel least worthy of celebration are precisely the moments when the inner child is clamoring for the attention and authentic, unearned love that was withheld, and the adult, still operating on old programming, responds by instinctively retreating, minimizing, and sabotaging the moment of recognition. The unhealed inner child is the source of that pervasive, aching loneliness that no amount of external achievement or recognition seems capable of truly soothing. It is the part of you that still believes that if you just keep your head down and perform well enough, then finally your parentee, or a parent surrogate, will see you and give you the love you desperately craved. The inner child's needs, for simple comfort, unconditional acceptance, and the freedom to be imperfect, are still completely unmet, driving the adult's exhausting, ceaseless search for external fulfillment. This unexpressed sorrow is the wellspring of the adult's low self-worth, a feeling that your fundamental existence is a flaw that must be compensated for by relentless overfunctioning and achievement. The adult might achieve incredible things, but the inner child only sees a desperate attempt to earn love, and therefore dismisses the achievement as just another performance, not a source of genuine self-worth. The silent wound creates an internal saboteur that minimizes every success, ensuring that the adult never truly steps into their light, because the child's survival depended on staying in the shadows. Healing this wound is not about forgetting the past, but about turning toward the inner child with the radical compassion and gentle validation that they were denied, finally breaking the cycle of emotional neglect. The adult must become the safe, present, and loving parent that the inner child never had, beginning the slow work of giving voice to the silent needs and validating the persistent, unexpressed pain. The silent wound of unworthiness manifests in adulthood as a complex, often paradoxical set of behavioral patterns that profoundly shape relationships, career, and basic self-care, particularly in the refusal to fully accept or enjoy celebration or recognition. In relationships, this might look like a profound difficulty with trust, where you constantly test your partner or proactively sabotage intimacy, because the inner, unhealed child believes that closeness inevitably leads to abandonment or emotional exploitation, repeating the original relational blueprint. Self-worth issues are rampant, often disguised by high achievement. The person may look incredibly successful on the outside, but internally, they constantly feel like an imposter, attributing success to luck or external factors, and therefore never truly integrating their accomplishments as part of their inherent value. Rest and self-care become a profound challenge, often feeling like a moral failure, because the old parentified program dictates that worth is tied to ceaseless productivity and service to others, making moments of genuine rest feel like an irresponsible luxury that must be earned through exhaustion. Emotional regulation is often impaired, not through explosive outbursts, but through chronic emotional suppression, where the adult has become so adept at masking their feelings that they struggle to even identify what they truly feel, leading to a kind of emotional numbness or an inability to advocate for their own needs in a clear and direct manner. This constellation of behaviors, the difficulty with trust, the imposter syndrome, the inability to rest, and the emotional suppression, are all direct, functional echoes of the child's survival strategy, an ongoing attempt to manage the world by making oneself as small, as useful, and as non-demanding as possible. ensuring that any moment of celebration feels deeply foreign and even dangerous to the nervous system. You might find yourself instinctively minimizing compliments, changing the subject, or feeling a physical cringe when others focus positive attention on you. Because deep down, the feeling of being celebrated feels like a spotlight exposing a vulnerability. The adult child often ends up in transactional relationships, unconsciously repeating the pattern of connecting through usefulness, always giving far more than they receive, because receiving feels like a debt that can never be truly repaid. Self-sabotage in moments of success is common, a subtle way of confirming the inner child's belief that they are not truly worthy of the good that has come to them, ensuring they stay safely within the emotional limits set in childhood. The perpetual need to overfunction and overdeliver is a manifestation of the fear of being seen as inadequate, a desperate attempt to preempt any criticism or emotional rejection by being impeccably perfect. This struggle with rest is the inability to let go of the emotional vigilance that was required to survive. The body and mind still convinced that the moment you relax, the threat will materialize. Emotional suppression leads to a profound disconnect from the adult's own needs, making it genuinely difficult to identify what they want or need in any given moment, and therefore, they are often left feeling perpetually unseen and unheard. The reluctance to celebrate is a refusal to draw attention to the self, a deeply ingrained avoidance of the parental spotlight, which was never safe, only conditional and critical. Healing requires a deliberate, gentle practice of allowing yourself to receive, to rest, and to celebrate the self not for what you do, but for the simple, profound fact of who you are. If you've heard something so far that resonates with the deepest, most quiet part of your struggle, that has finally given language to the feeling you've carried in silence for years, please let me know. In the comments below, simply copy and paste the phrase "the spotlight felt dangerous" to let me know you feel seen. Sharing even that simple phrase helps to break the profound isolation that comes with this wound and lets others in this community know that they are not walking this path alone. The deepest layer of this unworthiness is rooted in a fundamental biological drive, the instinctual need for attachment, which the child sacrifices their authenticity to secure. Because attachment, even a deeply flawed one, is biologically equated with survival. For a child, disconnection from the primary caregiver is a death sentence, a primal terror that overrides all other needs. And in the case of the narcissistic parent, the only path to maintaining a connection, however conditional, is through the sacrifice of the authentic self. The child unconsciously reasons, "I must be whatever my parent needs me to be, even if it hurts, because that is the only way I can ensure I am not abandoned." This is not a logical process, but a survival mechanism, a primal emotional calculation where the brain chooses the pain of inauthenticity over the terror of complete abandonment. This sacrifice of authenticity is the core trauma, resulting in an adult who has completely outsourced their sense of self-worth to external indicators, because the internal compass was broken by the need to constantly conform to the parent's shifting expectations, making any self-determined celebration feel entirely untrustworthy. The adult carries the imprint of that primal emotional reasoning, where self-care, self-focus, or authentic self-expression still registers as a potential threat to relational security, a betrayal of the original survival pact. The simple act of saying, "I am worthy of this joy," contradicts the lifetime of programming that says, "Your worth is conditional, dependent on your service, and must never take up too much space," leading to a deep, visceral internal conflict that sabotages the experience of genuine, unearned celebration. The child's brain chooses to believe the parent is right and they are wrong, accepting the blame for the parent's instability because that is emotionally safer than accepting the terrifying reality of an unsafe, unreliable caregiver. This instinctual need for attachment is so powerful that it overrides the child's natural desire for self-expression, leading to the early, profound suppression of their own emotional reality. The adult operates under a subtle, constant fear that if they show their true, messy, needing self, they will be instantly and irrevocably abandoned, just as their inner child was emotionally abandoned. The emotional reasoning is simple and devastating. My need for you is greater than my need for me, so I will erase me to keep you, and by extension, me, alive. This foundational sacrifice is why receiving authentic love or praise in adulthood feels so foreign and anxiety-producing. It was never part of the original, life-saving contract. The adult must slowly and deliberately re-educate their nervous system, teaching it that authentic self-expression and self-focus do not lead to abandonment, but to genuine connection. The feeling of unworthiness is the internal price paid for the preservation of the attachment bond, a long-term emotional debt incurred to survive a dangerous childhood. Healing involves reversing this primal calculation, asserting that your authenticity is non-negotiable and that your existence is worthy of celebration, independent of any external person or achievement. The long-term emotional and relational consequences of this foundational sacrifice are deep and pervasive, manifesting as a pervasive sense of internal narrative that is relentlessly self-critical, often feeling like a constant, quiet voice that echoes the most devaluing statements of the narcissistic parent, making self-compassion nearly impossible. This internalized critical voice is the shadow of the parent, an emotional guardrail ensuring you never overstep your bounds or make the mistake of believing you are genuinely worthy, which results in coping styles rooted in control, perfectionism, and an inability to simply be in the present moment without feeling the need to optimize or perform. The relational consequence is a pattern of choosing partners who, in subtle or overt ways, require the adult to perform the familiar caretaker role, or who are emotionally withholding, unconsciously recreating the original, painful dynamic because it is tragically what feels familiar and therefore, paradoxically, safe. The persistent internal narrative is the most insidious consequence, a belief that you are fundamentally broken, a flawed object that must be constantly managed and improved, which completely negates any external evidence of success or inherent value. This leads to chronic exhaustion and a pervasive sense of emptiness, because the adult is spending all their emotional energy on managing this internal critic and maintaining the performance, leaving no genuine reserve for pleasure, spontaneity, or true, deep connection, making the idea of celebrating themselves feel like an emotional extravagance they cannot afford. The coping styles are all aimed at control, controlling their environment, controlling their emotions, controlling others' perceptions, an attempt to achieve the perfect equilibrium that the child could never secure, ultimately leading to a life lived constantly on the emotional defensive, incapable of true relaxation or unearned self-acceptance. The adult's default coping mechanism is often to disappear in moments of conflict or emotional demand, repeating the child's survival strategy of minimizing the self to avoid confrontation or rejection. The perfectionism that drives so much of the adult's success is not a positive trait, but a desperate shield against the inevitable, perceived shame of failure, a frantic effort to control the narrative of their worth. The internalized critical voice ensures that even when others are celebrating you, the internal reality is one of harsh judgment, minimizing the achievement and highlighting every perceived flaw. Relational patterns are often marked by an inability to receive genuine support or love, deflecting acts of kindness because they feel too vulnerable, or they trigger the anxiety of a debt that must be repaid. The feeling of pervasive emptiness is the void left by the unexpressed, authentic self, a deep sense that even when surrounded by people, the real you is still in hiding, lonely and unseen. The long-term consequence is a body and mind locked in a perpetual state of stress, carrying the chronic weight of responsibility and the inability to let down the guard that was put up in childhood. This internal legacy is the reason why the concept of unconditional worth feels abstract and intellectual, while the feeling of conditional worth is a deeply felt, somatic reality. Healing demands the courageous and patient work of separating your voice from the internalized voice of the narcissistic parent, gently dismantling the critical narrative that has defined your emotional reality. The first and most courageous step toward healing is the act of awareness and witnessing, the brave choice to turn toward the silent wound and simply name what happened, giving yourself permission to validate the emotional reality that was constantly denied by the narcissistic parent, breaking the cycle of self-gaslighting. Witnessing means seeing the child you were, not through the distorting lens of your parents' narrative, but through your own eyes, acknowledging the specific moments of emotional pain, neglect, or forced performance, and holding those moments with tender, fierce compassion, without minimizing or rationalizing the parent's behavior. This act of self-witnessing is revolutionary because it interrupts the relentless self-gaslighting, the habit of telling yourself, "It wasn't that bad," "I'm being too sensitive," or "I should just get over it," which are all internalized echoes of the parent's own refusal to validate your reality. Breaking self-gaslighting is the process of gently, but firmly, taking back control of your own internal narrative, trusting your own emotional experience, and asserting that your pain was real, valid, and deserved to be seen and soothed at the time, even though it wasn't. It is the beginning of radical self-trust, the slow, painstaking work of believing yourself over the programmed doubt that has been your default setting, allowing yourself to feel the grief and the anger that were suppressed in childhood because they were deemed too dangerous to express, and witnessing their existence without judgment. Awareness is not about fixing or changing anything immediately, but simply about holding the emotional truth of your experience in a safe, compassionate space, creating the first internal sanctuary where the performer can finally take a breath and the real self can tentatively emerge from hiding, no longer needing to earn their place in the light. Witnessing is the act of becoming your own most reliable witness, finally believing the reality of your childhood experience over the lifelong habit of minimizing your pain. The core of self-gaslighting is the internalized voice of the parent telling you that your emotional reality is wrong or exaggerated, a pattern you must consciously interrupt with validation. This awareness is not an intellectual exercise, but a deep, somatic recognition that your body's chronic tension, your difficulty with rest, and your self-minimizing behaviors are all rational responses to an irrational past. Allowing yourself to feel the full weight of the grief for the childhood you should have had is a crucial step in witnessing, a necessary release of the suppressed emotional reality. The first act of radical self-care is simply to sit with the pain without the need to immediately distract, fix, or analyze it away, giving the inner child the presence they never received. Witnessing the wound allows you to begin to separate the past from the present, recognizing that the emotional emergency protocols that saved you then are the constraints that bind you now. This conscious choice to validate your own reality is the moment you begin to reclaim your identity from the performance, stepping off the stage and into the quiet safety of your own internal truth. By acknowledging the origin of the feeling of unworthiness, you simultaneously begin to strip it of its power, transforming it from an invisible truth into a tangible, treatable wound. The high-functioning adult wound is the painful paradox of the adult child of a narcissist who, despite achieving significant professional or social success, still carries all the survival patterns of chronic responsibility, emotional suppression, and relentless overfunctioning, leading to a profound internal exhaustion that belies their external achievements. This is the individual who can manage a large team, orchestrate complex projects, and provide deep emotional support to friends, but who cannot sit still for 5 minutes without feeling anxious, who constantly prioritizes everyone else's needs above their own, and who secretly believes that their next failure is just around the corner, waiting to expose their deep-buried, fundamental fraudulence. The wound is hidden behind a polished facade of capability. The outside world sees strength and success, but the internal reality is a nervous system constantly strained by the burden of perpetual duty and the inability to trust that anyone else can handle things without their intervention. Chronic responsibility is the core of this wound, a deeply ingrained belief that if you do not carry the weight, everything will fall apart. A direct continuation of the child's desperate need to stabilize the unstable parent and environment, leading to a life lived perpetually in the mode of being on call. Emotional suppression is a necessary component of this performance, because the high-functioning adult cannot afford to break down, cannot afford to be messy, and certainly cannot afford to express vulnerability or need, which would compromise the carefully constructed image of complete control and competence, making authentic intimacy profoundly difficult. The inability to rest is a direct consequence of this. Rest feels dangerous because it means letting go of control, dropping the guard, and allowing the terrified, exhausted inner child to be seen, a vulnerability that the old programming screams is a recipe for disaster and rejection, further cementing the feeling that they must endlessly earn their peace. The success of the high-functioning adult is often built on the very foundation of their trauma, using their childhood-honed skills of hypervigilance and emotional anticipation to excel in a world that rewards productivity. This constant performance of competency requires immense emotional energy, leaving the adult feeling perpetually depleted, even when their life is objectively stable and successful. The chronic responsibility is an emotional compulsion, an inability to delegate or trust, rooted in the childhood belief that only you can prevent the emotional catastrophe. Emotional suppression creates a barrier to intimacy, as the adult unconsciously holds back their true feelings, fearing that their messiness or genuine need will compromise the relationship, as it did in the original relational dynamic. The high-functioning wound means that the person is constantly striving for a state of perfect safety and worthiness that is perpetually just out of reach, because the goalposts are always internal, set by the internalized critical parent. The adult must learn that their worth is not tied to their function, a profound and terrifying lesson that requires a conscious, radical choice to start living imperfectly and letting things be messy. This wound is often the most difficult to heal because the outside world constantly rewards and validates the very coping mechanisms that are causing the internal suffering, making change feel counterintuitive. Healing demands that the adult deliberately choose rest, vulnerability, and self-focus, even when every fiber of their being and every external reward system is screaming at them to keep performing. The legacy of narcissistic parenting is often recognized in subtle, almost unconscious physical and emotional patterns, like the chronic habit of holding your breath when entering a new space or relationship, or the profound, internalized need to seek permission for basic self-care, self-expression, or even joy, long after the parent's physical influence has waned. The breath holding is a somatic echo of the child's hypervigilance, a physical manifestation of the body bracing for the next expected blow or demand, a nervous system that learned to freeze and wait rather than spontaneously relax, leading to chronic shallow breathing and an inability to fully ground in the present moment, constantly living in a state of physical and emotional contraction. This simple, unconscious act of constriction is a powerful symbol of the emotional life lived on a razor's edge, always prepared for the emergency that may never come. The need for permission-seeking is a clear sign that the adult's internal authority was completely externalized in childhood, where every choice, every emotion, and every move was subjected to the scrutiny and approval of the narcissistic parent, leaving an adult who feels fundamentally incapable of trusting their own judgment or deserving their own self-determination. You might find yourself constantly asking others if it's okay to rest, if it's okay to spend money on yourself, or if it's okay to simply say no to a demand, even when the answer is obviously yes, because the internal operating system still believes that self-focus requires external validation to be legitimate. Recognizing these small, insidious patterns is the work of excavating the past from the present, seeing the ways in which the child's survival protocols are still dictating the limits of the adult's freedom and joy. A profound acknowledgement that the internal shackles are self-imposed, but that they were originally forged in a relationship that demanded your erasure. The breath holding is the body's trauma language, a physical memory of the child's need to be quiet, still, and invisible to avoid becoming the target of the parent's emotional instability. You might notice yourself holding your breath before you speak, before you ask for a raise, or before you express a vulnerability, the body preparing itself for the expected, negative parental response. The constant seeking of external permission is a desperate attempt to re-establish the safety that was only ever granted by the parent's approval, even if the adult knows logically they are free to choose. This legacy means that you often give away your power without a second thought, unconsciously defaulting to the belief that others know better or are more deserving of self-determination than you are. Recognizing the pattern of permission-seeking is the first step toward reclaiming your internal authority, consciously giving yourself the permission that you have been waiting for someone else to grant. The adult must practice the revolutionary act of simply doing something for their own joy or comfort without analyzing it, justifying it, or seeking external validation for the choice. The process of healing is found in these tiny acts of resistance, the conscious choice to take a deep, grounding breath, and the deliberate decision to trust your own wisdom and desire. By seeing these patterns not as character flaws, but as historical artifacts, you can begin the patient, necessary work of retirement for these exhausted survival protocols. The path to healing, and the only true antidote to the profound feeling of unworthiness, is the reparenting process, the deliberate, gentle, and sustained commitment to give the inner child what they were never given: unconditional love, safety, emotional attunement, and unwavering self-validation, essentially becoming the wise, compassionate, and reliable parent you always needed. This is not about blaming the past, but about actively creating a new, internal future. Recognizing that the unmet needs of the past are still present and can only be truly healed by the adult you have become, who finally possesses the maturity and resources to provide the safe haven the child was denied. Reparenting is an active process of listening to the quiet, subtle language of the inner child, their fears, their small moments of joy, their protests, and their deep need for rest, and responding with the consistent empathy and presence that the narcissistic parent was incapable of providing. It involves a radical shift in internal dialogue, replacing the harsh, critical voice of the internalized parent with a voice of gentle, unwavering acceptance, consciously speaking to yourself as you would to a beloved, innocent child who is afraid and in pain, affirming their inherent goodness and worthiness regardless of their performance or achievements. This is the practice of self-attunement, where you prioritize checking in with your own emotional state, asking yourself, what do I truly feel and what do I need right now? And then responding to that need with actionable kindness, such as setting a boundary, allowing rest, or simply offering a moment of non-judgmental comfort, thereby demonstrating that your own needs are finally being taken seriously. The reparenting process is the slow, revolutionary work of building an internal foundation of safety that finally allows the adult to relax the hypervigilance and the need to constantly perform, because they know, deep down, that the most important person in their world, themselves, is finally reliable and truly on their side. Reparenting means consciously giving the inner child the simple, profound permissions that were withheld. Permission to be imperfect, permission to need, permission to rest, and permission to feel uninhibited joy. This process involves recognizing the adult's capacity to regulate their own nervous system, utilizing grounding techniques and self-soothing practices to demonstrate to the inner child that the threat is no longer present. The key is consistency, showing up for your own needs not just when you feel like it, but especially in moments of stress, thereby demonstrating the unwavering reliability that the parent lacked. You become the fierce protector of your own boundaries, saying no to external demands that compromise your peace, and thereby teaching the inner child that their safety is the adult's highest priority. Reparenting is the most direct path to dismantling the feeling of unworthiness, because it replaces the foundation of conditional love with the bedrock of unwavering, unconditional self-acceptance. The adult consciously celebrates the small, quiet victories of the inner child, the moment they finally ask for help, the moment they allow themselves to rest, the moment they express a genuine, messy feeling. This intentional, loving presence begins to heal the silent wound, allowing the authentic self to slowly emerge from hiding, no longer needing to perform for external survival. The true gift of reparenting is the ability to finally trust yourself, knowing that you will never abandon your own needs again, thereby dissolving the primal fear that fueled the initial sacrifice of authenticity. Shadow work, in the context of healing from narcissistic parenting, is the courageous and necessary task of turning toward the suppressed, disowned, and emotionally painful parts of the self, the grief, the profound rage, the messy neediness, and the core shame of not being enough, with radical honesty and non-judgmental presence, and consciously sitting with the raw, uncomfortable emotions that have been expertly avoided. The shadow holds the emotions and desires that the narcissistic parent deemed unacceptable or threatening, forcing the child to push them into deep hiding, and these suppressed emotions do not disappear. They manifest as the adult's anxieties, self-sabotage, and the inability to fully step into their power, making the unworthiness feel like an intractable feature of their personality. Sitting with this grief is essential, because the adult must finally mourn the loss of the loving, safe childhood they deserved, allowing the tears that were never allowed to be shed and validating the profound sense of betrayal and emotional abandonment that was never acknowledged. The act of turning toward the pain is terrifying because the old programming associates these shadow feelings, especially rage and need, with severe punishment or rejection. But the adult must consciously create an internal container of safety where these emotions can finally be expressed and integrated, understanding that they are not flaws, but simply unexpressed parts of a valid human experience. This involves recognizing that the anger you feel is a righteous response to a profound injustice, and the neediness you suppress is a completely natural, human need for connection and belonging. Reframing these emotions as necessary messengers rather than shameful flaws to be perpetually controlled. Shadow work is the necessary bridge to self-acceptance. The moment you realize that true wholeness does not mean eliminating your imperfections or your pain, but embracing the entirety of your human experience, allowing the messy, flawed, and deeply feeling self to finally be welcomed home, thereby dissolving the need to perform a false image of perfect composure. Shadow work requires facing the internalized belief that you are fundamentally unlovable or broken, and consciously challenging that core shame with evidence of your inherent goodness and worthiness. The repressed rage, often directed inward as self-criticism, must be gently acknowledged and safely expressed, recognizing that it is the adult's healthy response to the original injustice and emotional abuse. Sitting with grief means allowing the pain of the past to move through you without trying to fix, rationalize, or distract from the overwhelming sense of loss for the childhood you were denied. This is the process of integrating the bad parts of yourself, the parts that were criticized or rejected by the parent, and realizing that those parts are simply aspects of your humanity that deserve love and acceptance. Shadow work dissolves the black and white thinking of the child, allowing the adult to hold the complexity of their experience. They can be high-achieving and deeply wounded, strong and incredibly needy. By bringing these suppressed emotions into the light of awareness, you strip them of their power to control your present behavior through unconscious sabotage and self-minimization. The courage to face your deepest pain is the ultimate act of self-love, demonstrating to the inner child that you are finally safe enough to be fully and authentically seen, even by yourself. This integration of the shadow is what transforms the shame of unworthiness into the profound, quiet self-acceptance that is the true hallmark of healing and empowerment. The persistent feeling of unworthiness, rooted in the trauma of narcissistic parenting, manifests in concrete, often heartbreaking ways within adult relationships, repeating the original dynamic where the adult child unconsciously chooses partners and interactions that force them back into the familiar, but painful, roles of caretaker, overfunctioner, or emotional regulator, which subtly reinforces the belief that their value is purely transactional. You might find yourself constantly overgiving in friendships, offering endless emotional support but feeling completely incapable of asking for or receiving genuine help in return, perpetuating the old narrative that your role is to serve, not to be served, and that your own needs are a burden that will lead to abandonment. This dynamic plays out in romantic relationships through an inability to accept unearned praise or affection. A genuine compliment might be immediately deflected or minimized, not out of false modesty, but because the inner child is screaming, "This isn't real, it's a trap. You'll have to pay for this later with emotional labor." The adult child might also find themselves constantly chasing after emotionally unavailable partners or demanding friends, unconsciously seeking to recreate the original challenge of winning the narcissistic parent's approval, believing that if they can just fix or earn the love of this difficult person, they will finally prove their worthiness and heal the original wound. In moments of conflict, the tendency is often to immediately apologize, even when not at fault, or to completely shut down and disappear, avoiding the necessary vulnerability of standing up for their own needs. Because the fight-or-flight response defaults to the child's mechanism of self-erasure to keep the environment safe. These relational patterns are not failures of character, but heartbreakingly accurate reenactments of the only way the adult learned to connect, through self-sacrifice and chronic responsibility. And recognizing them as such is the essential first step to breaking the pattern and choosing relationships that celebrate the authentic, non-performing self. The adult often finds themselves in the role of the perpetual therapist or fixer in their relationships, feeling most valuable and secure when they are actively solving someone else's problem, thereby avoiding focus on their own complex emotional needs. A profound difficulty in setting and maintaining healthy boundaries is a clear relational manifestation, a continuation of the childhood necessity of having no boundaries with the emotionally invasive narcissistic parent. In intimate relationships, you might constantly fear being too much or not enough, leading to a pattern of preemptive retreat or hyper-adaptation to the partner's perceived desires, sacrificing your own genuine wants. The inability to receive a gift or a compliment gracefully is the adult child's instinctual defense mechanism against the vulnerability of being truly seen and valued for simply existing rather than for a performance. The tendency to constantly seek validation from others, rather than trusting their own internal compass, keeps the adult in a state of emotional dependence, subtly recreating the power dynamic of their childhood. You might be drawn to people who subtly minimize your success or your pain, because that feels tragically familiar and aligns with the deep internal narrative of unworthiness, making healthy relationships feel strangely unsettling. The work is to choose relationships where you are celebrated for your truth, not for your performance, and to practice the terrifying vulnerability of receiving love and support without the urge to immediately reciprocate or deflect. Healing in relationships means learning the revolutionary act of simply stating your need, without apology or justification, and allowing yourself to be cared for without having to earn it first. To truly begin the work of reparenting and dissolving the deep, ingrained feeling of unworthiness, you must turn inward and ask the foundational questions, not as a means of seeking external answers, but as a tender inquiry into the heart of the wounded inner child. What did the child I was need that they did not receive? What were the core emotional needs for safety, for unconditional acceptance, for playful presence, for true, felt validation, that were systematically left unmet by the narcissistic parent, forcing the child to substitute performance for genuine connection? The answer to these questions is not simple intellectual data, but the emotional blueprint for your healing, providing the exact emotional ingredients that you must now consciously and consistently provide to yourself in your adulthood. The exploration of emotional needs must be gentle and non-judgmental, acknowledging that the child needed to be seen for their messy, authentic self, not for their utility. They needed their pain to be witnessed without minimization, and they needed to be held in their imperfection, rather than constantly pressured toward an impossible standard of perfection. Your own adult self is the only one who can truly answer these questions, and the process of asking them is the first step in actively providing the missing emotional nourishment, giving voice to the silent needs that still drive your adult self-sabotage and your inability to receive celebration. By identifying the specific emotional deficits, the lack of safe emotional expression, the absence of play, the consistent invalidation, you create a map for your reparenting efforts, transforming the amorphous feeling of unworthiness into a series of actionable, self-compassionate choices that directly address the core wound. The foundational question is a radical act of validation, asserting that the child's needs were not only legitimate, but were essential for healthy development, and that the failure to meet them was not the child's fault. You might discover the child needed to simply be without a task, to feel the quiet safety of a non-anxious presence, or to know that their small joys and sorrows mattered unconditionally. The process of naming these unmet needs is the act of giving them legitimacy, finally allowing the adult to consciously pursue those needs as a priority, rather than pushing them into the shadow. Ask yourself, what would a truly good parent have done in that moment of my pain or joy? And then commit to doing that very thing for yourself, gently and consistently. This exploration allows you to move beyond the generalized feeling of badness and to understand the unworthiness as a direct, rational consequence of a specific emotional deficit in your environment. The answer to what the inner child needed is the syllabus for your life's next chapter, guiding you toward emotional choices that prioritize self-safety, authenticity, and unearned self-acceptance. Healing is the commitment to meet those identified emotional needs, one small, consistent act of self-love at a time, thereby dissolving the shame of the past with the reliable kindness of the present. The ultimate goal of this inquiry is to arrive at the simple, profound truth. I am worthy because I exist, and my needs are valid because they are human. A self-given validation that requires no external permission. The transformation away from the core belief of unworthiness begins when the foundational questions are answered. the inner child is witnessed, and the reparenting process takes root, leading to the gradual emergence of new, healthy patterns that center safety, boundaries, and a fearless, unadulterated authenticity. This is not about becoming a new person, but about reclaiming the identity that was forced into hiding, allowing the natural, vibrant self to finally exist without the burden of constant performance and fear of rejection. Safety is the first new pattern to emerge. It's the quiet, internal feeling of knowing that you are emotionally reliable for yourself, that you will not abandon your own needs, and that the world is no longer perpetually threatening, which allows the hypervigilance to slowly relax its grip on your nervous system. Boundaries are the second pillar of this transformation, the concrete, often terrifying, application of self-respect that allows the adult to say no without guilt, to prioritize their own emotional and physical well-being, and to protect their energy from the invasive demands of others, a necessary act of self-protection that teaches the inner child that their personal space is sacred and inviolable. Authenticity, the final jewel of this transformation, is the quiet, profound freedom of being able to express your true thoughts, feelings, and desires without the constant filtering and self-editing that defined your past. A radical transparency that allows for genuine, non-transactional connection with others and, most importantly, with yourself. This transformation is not a sudden epiphany, but a slow, patient process of consistently choosing self-compassion over self-criticism, self-protection over self-sacrifice, and internal validation over the exhausting chase for external approval, ultimately dissolving the core wound of unworthiness and allowing you to accept and enjoy the unearned celebration of your own existence. The new pattern of safety manifests as an ability to simply relax and be without the compulsion to fix, perform, or constantly scan the environment for emotional danger. Setting a boundary is a declaration of self-worth, a tangible act of reparenting that teaches the inner child that they no longer have to accommodate emotional exploitation to secure belonging. Authenticity is the quiet joy of realizing you no longer need to check your own reality against the approval of others, that your truth is enough, and that you are worthy of being seen as you are. The transformation involves a subtle shift in relational dynamics, where you start attracting people who value your genuine self, rather than those who are drawn to your capacity to overfunction and caretake. The feeling of unworthiness transforms into a profound, quiet self-acceptance. The deep knowledge that your flaws and your pain are simply parts of your human story, not obstacles to your inherent worth. This transformation allows you to finally step into your full power, not as a performer seeking applause, but as an integrated, whole being who is simply and unapologetically taking up their rightful space in the world. The adult begins to experience moments of unadulterated joy and celebration, not as a terrifying vulnerability, but as a simple, deserved pleasure that requires no justification or self-minimization. The final stage of transformation is the ability to look at the self, including the wounded past, with radical kindness and acceptance, realizing that you are finally, truly, and safely home within yourself. As the transformation takes hold, it is helpful to anchor the experience in the wisdom that transcends the personal narrative, such as the quiet insight that the wound is the place where the light enters you, which reminds us that the profound suffering endured in a narcissistic environment is not merely a source of pain, but the very crucible through which true depth, empathy, and integrated self-awareness are forged. This external wisdom serves to reframe the entire healing journey, moving it from a narrative of victimhood and deficit to one of profound strength and alchemical transformation, acknowledging that the intense emotional labor of survival has, ironically, prepared you for a deeper, more resilient self-acceptance than those who never had to fight for their own existence. The reference is emotionally relevant because it validates the immense courage required to face the wound, asserting that the very sensitivities and vulnerabilities that made you susceptible to the narcissistic dynamic are, when integrated, the source of your greatest wisdom, allowing you to turn your past suffering into a source of profound connection and empathetic understanding for others on a similar journey. This realization is a moment of profound psychological integration, dissolving the final layer of shame by transforming the wound from a flaw to a sacred part of your life story, a necessary path to the integrated, whole self who is finally worthy of their own light. The power of this reference is that it helps dissolve the lingering shame of the past, affirming that your struggle was not a failure but a necessary, painful step toward self-actualization. It transforms the traumatic experience into a source of unique, hard-won wisdom, allowing you to value the sensitivity and deep emotional awareness that you learned in order to survive. This consciousness reference provides permission to see the pain not as something to be hidden or erased, but as an essential part of the tapestry of your resilient, whole self. It shifts the focus from what you lost in childhood to the profound emotional and psychological resources you gained in your capacity to adapt, survive, and now, finally, to heal. The external wisdom reminds the adult that the work of healing is not just for the self, but that their very transformation becomes a light and a guide for others who are still navigating the shadow. It is the final, gentle validation that your worthiness is not restored by eliminating the past, but by integrating the entire story, pain and all, into a cohesive, accepting whole. The deepest, most integrated transformation occurs when you can look at the wound and genuinely thank it for what it taught you about strength, compassion, and the necessity of self-love. This profound reframing is the ultimate act of empowerment, turning the legacy of narcissistic parenting into a foundation of unshakable, self-derived worth. Healing, in the context of the adult child of a narcissist, is not a process of becoming a new person, nor is it about completely erasing the scars of the past. It is the profound, quiet act of reclaiming the identity that was forced into hiding, giving the authentic, messy, fully human self permission to emerge and exist without the burden of constant performance. The true measure of healing is not the absence of all pain or anxiety, which is an impossible, perfectionistic goal, but the ability to hold your own pain with compassion, to witness your own struggle without self-judgment, and to respond to your own needs with the same kindness and fierce protection you would offer a vulnerable loved one. It is the realization that you were never broken, only profoundly hurt, and that the process is simply to put down the survival tools that are no longer necessary, to stop the exhausting performance, and to finally allow yourself the simple, profound reality of being good enough, just as you are. This redefining of healing is a rejection of the narcissistic parent's impossible standard of perfection and the embrace of a radical, self-generated acceptance, recognizing that your inherent worth was never contingent upon your achievement or your utility to others, but was simply a birthright that was temporarily obscured by trauma. The goal is integration, not erasure. It is the acceptance that the high-functioning achiever and the terrified inner child can coexist, and that the person who was once paralyzed by the fear of celebration can now allow themselves moments of genuine, unearned joy, because the internal critic no longer holds the ultimate veto power over their self-perception. Healing is, ultimately, the final, permanent act of turning inward and deciding that the voice of self-compassion is louder and more authoritative than the internalized voice of the parent's devaluing criticism, leading to a life lived with quiet dignity, self-trust, and an unshakable, self-derived sense of belonging. The reclamation of identity is the choice to define yourself by your own values, desires, and emotional reality, rather than by the expectations and projections of your past. Healing is the ability to finally separate the shame that belongs to the parent from the inherent goodness that belongs to the self. A clear, necessary drawing of an emotional boundary. The true sign of healing is the ability to rest without guilt, to prioritize your own joy without justification, and to receive love without the immediate urge to repay or deflect. Redefining healing means acknowledging that the journey is non-linear, and that a moment of regression is not a failure, but simply an opportunity to offer yourself more patience and compassion. It is the commitment to live from a place of authenticity, even when it feels vulnerable or requires you to be messy, because you have established an internal safety net of self-acceptance. The profound transformation is the ability to move from feeling like a perpetual consequence of your past to feeling like the conscious, empowered author of your own emotional future. Healing is the quiet, daily revolution of choosing to believe your own voice over the echo of your trauma, gently dissolving the lie of unworthiness with the truth of your inherent value. This integrated self is the one who finally knows, with a deep, embodied certainty, that they are not only worthy of celebration, but that their simple existence is a quiet, powerful triumph. The final integration of this profound healing journey is the quiet, powerful moment when you truly become whole, reconnecting the high-functioning adult self with the vulnerable, wounded inner child, forging an internal alliance where the adult's strength is used to protect and nurture the child's sensitivity, and the child's authentic emotional core informs the adult's capacity for genuine joy and presence. Integration means that the inner critic no longer runs the show, but is slowly, patiently being retired, replaced by an unwavering, gentle self-advocacy that prioritizes your peace and your authenticity above all external expectations, dissolving the lifelong need to perform for conditional acceptance. This is the moment you stop waiting for permission to be happy, to rest, or to celebrate your own journey, recognizing that the only necessary validation is the one you grant yourself, a quiet, non-negotiable decree of your own inherent worth that is impervious to external criticism or praise. The enduring legacy of this work is a life lived from a foundation of safety, where the nervous system is finally allowed to relax its chronic vigilance, and the adult can fully inhabit their own skin with a sense of quiet, self-derived dignity, allowing the self to be the safe haven they never had, and finally realizing that they are not only worthy of celebration, but that the life they have rebuilt is a quiet, profound miracle that deserves to be honored in every moment. If this journey has illuminated the subtle, persistent ways your past has shaped your present, and if you are ready to continue building a life defined by your own worth, rather than your performance, I invite you to join this community. We are a growing family dedicated to the slow, courageous work of healing and self-reclamation. Please take a moment to hit the subscribe button and gently tap the like button on this video. Your subscription is a quiet commitment to your own healing and to receiving the consistent, compassionate guidance you need to reparent yourself and finally step into the light of your own genuine self-worth, reminding yourself that you are not alone in this beautiful, hard work. Thank you for being here, for your courage, and for the profoundly important work you are doing for the child within you. The final emotional closing is one of grounded empowerment and profound self-compassion. You are not your wound, you are not the performance, and you are not the voice of the narcissistic parent, but a whole, complex, and resilient human being who survived a difficult, unchosen past, and has emerged with the capacity for radical self-love and the wisdom to know that your value is non-negotiable. Step gently into the day, knowing that the most important relationship you will ever have is the one you have with yourself, and that today is another opportunity to give your inner child the rest, the validation, and the unconditional acceptance that they always deserved. The healing is happening now, not in some future perfect state, but in the small, consistent moments of choosing kindness over criticism, and choosing the quiet truth of your authentic self over the loud demands of the past performance. Be kind to yourself. You have carried an immense weight, and you are finally, profoundly free to put it down and simply be.